So inequality costs in employment tribunals and discrimination cases as well. The damage it does to individuals and organisations and their standing. It creates negativity. And what we would like to see, particularly in Economics UK, and economics, by the way, is a fusion of equality and economic justice, and you might have got that by now. What we'd like to see is a much more positive light. Because as you can see from some of the pictures and some of the images we get, that we're very often working on a deficit model. And in this picture, all right, it's the Daily Mail, so we can perhaps ignore it, but these pictures of a lovely nuclear family who are leaving the country and those who are coming in, some of them illegal, you can see the imagery and you could almost transpose those pictures completely and it would still be true. So what I'm saying is the imagery we get is a very negative one. It could be that we have lots of people wanting to leave the country who are actually immigrants, and we have a white nuclear family coming into the UK, which is often the case from Australia or the States or Canada or Poland or wherever. So don't always buy into the media. Here's another image. And Jack Straw, who's the Minister for Justice, earlier, 2008 I think it was, said that he couldn't really communicate with people in his constituency if they were wearing a hijab. Now that's ironic, isn't it? Because the people I can't communicate with are doctors usually that just don't actually speak my language, and that's English. To me, it's not women in hijabs that cause the problem. So why there is this media furore about women in hijabs really baffles me. Because if we want to look at items of clothing that are indicators of wrongdoing, I would look no further than perhaps grey men in grey suits round the tables of the United Nations table who have called illegal wars. Sorry for anybody who's wearing a grey suit in the room, but you get my point. To focus on what people are wearing and how they speak and whether they got the right values and customs is entirely missing the point about their rights and their citizenship. So in England, I think we have what I call a CID agenda. Basically, because everything that government seems to think of begins with a C or an I or a D. And so these are some of the things that are coming up. On citizenship, let me just say that the legislation we have at the moment requires all new migrants, when they come into the UK, to swear an oath of allegiance to the Queen and all of her descendants. And I find that really richly ironic, because if you look at all of her descendants, they're a right motley crew. I mean, there's affairs, divorces, there's Nazi uniforms, and yet it's migrants that have to swear allegiance to them. I think it should be the other way round, really, because it's usually migrant families who are the best families, best behaved, really want to get on in the country, and so it's not them that break the laws. They also have to take an English test and a citizenship test. And my view is this, that if we want to have citizenship tests and cohesion tests and whatever else, and English tests, we should roll it out to everybody and start first with the far-right parties, with the British National Party, because they certainly need citizenship tests, and they certainly need how to learn how to speak English properly as well. So that's where we should start. On cohesion, this juggernaut of cohesion that's coming at us, despite what we say, I just don't get it. You know, the whole cohesion agenda was set up by a white man after the Burnley and Oldham riots. And what he was basically saying is, we live parallel lives, we live in segregation, and that's what is causing the problems. It's not true. There is research from the Manchester University which shows that actually integration has got better in the last 10 years. Well, segregation is not true. It's not true of England. It is half as much as it is of the US and of most of Europe. So don't buy into that. On immigration and asylum, I mean, I won't go through all of these because I haven't got time, but we know the draconic legislation that discriminates against asylum seekers, as if somehow asylum seekers is illegal. It isn't. I mean, this is under the Geneva Conventions, that to be an asylum seeker is perfectly within someone's rights, and yet we malign them. They're often called economic migrants, which makes me laugh. Because the only way you ever get to come into the UK is if you've got something to offer economically. Yeah? So it's not a question of wanting to take economically, it's what you've got to offer, that the basis on migration. On internment, we have still got internment where people are detained without trial for 42 days. We have to ask ourselves on integration, who has segregated who? Because when there are recent surveys that said 67% of Muslims actually have non-Muslim friends, but 94% of white English people don't have any friends that are of a different ethnicity, you have to ask yourself who's segregated. Trevor Phillips said 67% of one ethnicity living in one area defines a ghetto. Well, to me, that's most of white Britain, right? But we don't call them ghettos. So the emotive language that's being used is not acceptable. Islamophobia, ID cards, the DNA database, which was in the news this morning, where at least 30% of young people on that database are young black people. And diversity, is it a myth? Is it a more comfortable term? Do we really celebrate diversity and the values of different groups? I'm not sure we do across Ireland and the UK. We use it as a nice and comfortable word, just like cohesion, just like integration. But we actually don't talk about the structural disadvantages, the structural inequalities, the economic injustice, the levels of poverty, which means you can't have inclusion and you can't have integration. So we need to challenge the discourse, the CID discourse that's around. And I noticed that that's part of the research that the Equality and Rights Alliance have also put forward, that they've said we've got to challenge the discourse. So here's some figures that I drew up from, these are from England, but I got some on Ireland as well. But it staggered me when I first found out about these figures, that compared to 25% of white children living in poverty, which is amazing in the first place, and don't get me wrong, we need to really make sure we do something about that. But to say that there are 56% of African children, 72% of Bangladeshi children, 60% of Pakistani children living in poverty in the UK is absolutely incredible to me. Why in 2009, nearly to 2010, we're not saying more about that? You know, somebody asked me, are you sure these aren't figures from Africa? I said, no, they're actually from the UK. We ought to be doing something about that, because with those levels of poverty, you can't have the inclusion that we need. In Ireland, the National Economic and Social Forum said that Ireland has become one of the most unequal countries in the developed world, and it has one of the highest levels of income inequality of the 30 countries of the OECD. In the OECD, 13% of all young people left school early, so that's what they said about Ireland. 63% of traveller children leaving school early. And 5.1% of persons in Ireland were in consistent poverty, while 17.2% of unemployed persons were in consistent poverty. So even when you're working, you can be in poverty. So it's about making sure we have a living wage as well. And the unemployment rate has just gone up, so we'd expect these figures to be worse. One of the things that the Joseph Rowntree Foundation has said recently is that the problem with a lot of the work that the government is doing at the moment, looking at fairness and fair funding regimes for social care, for example, is that they base that notion of fairness on efficiency and money, rather than on what it means for a distributive principle or on a broader social aim. So they've laid out in several papers different options for looking at fairness. And what I would suggest to all of us, besides calling for a Community Reinvestment Act, is that we have a political and philosophical discussion about what we mean by fairness. Where do we really mean spread the money, or is there a broader social end to which we are all working? And that's why economic justice isn't just about giving everybody equal money. It's about much broader aims than that. But we need the discussions in order to achieve that. And Amartya Sen, who's one of my favourite economists, because he's Indian, no, it's not, really talks about the need to achieve equity and fairness, not just through money, but through a broader social end.